大家好，今天是2025年4月7日，我们来看一下这个川普他的这个关税的税率啊，每个国家都不一样啊，他是怎么算出来的？网上有这个小哥来分享啊，我们一起来跟着学习一下。
Will be over 10% inflation on all goods imported into the US as paid by US consumers. Their numbers, their equation. Let me explain.
I'd like to see the chart if you have it. I think you can, for the most part, see it. Those with good eyes, with bad eyes. Thanks a lot, Eric. I think you better take it with you. It's not going to last very long.
2 days ago, Trump had a big press event to celebrate Liberation Day where he waved around some physical spreadsheets, which obviously caught my eye. And watching the footage, I'm like, it looks like the second column is just half the first column, but with a floor of 10%. So of course I went and found them online, put them into an actual spreadsheet, put in a formula, and yes, the second column is just half the first column, but with a minimum of 10%. I was like, that's interesting. I didn't put any further thought into where those equations come from. I'd satisfied my curiosity for the time, because the next day, the Trump administration, they know how to get me. They released an equation. They're like, this is the equation of where those percentages came from. And I was like, okay, fine, I'll do it. So I had a closer look at the equation, and I'm now qualified to talk you through it. This equation does indeed calculate all the values in that first column of the spreadsheet Trump was waving around, which means it represents the tariffs charged to the USA, and I quote, including currency manipulation and trade barriers. Except it doesn't. That's not what that is. This is not calculating the tariffs other countries are charging the US. This is calculating the tariffs the US would have to charge other countries in order to get trade balance. For example, last year, Australia bought from the US $34.6 billion worth of stuff. And that's US dollars, not the local dollary-doos. At the same time, the US only bought $16.7 billion worth of things from Australia. So from the US's point of view, Australia gave them more money than the US gave Australia, to the tune of a $17.6 billion trade surplus. And surplus sounds positive, it just means Australia bought more things from the US than it sold. Now New Zealand is the other way around. Very similar country, I would say, not everyone would. And Australia bought from the US $4.5 billion worth of things last year. The US, however, bought $5.5 billion worth of things from New Zealand. So that means the US is running a £1.1 billion deficit, a trade deficit, which sounds bad, just means the US bought a lot of, New Zealand wine. But let's just say hypothetically it was bad, and the US wanted to balance out its trade with New Zealand, it would need to reduce the amount it imports from New Zealand by 19.6% to get back down to parity. And that is what this equation tells you. On the left-hand side, that triangle is a delta that represents the amount of change. The tau, the T-looking thing, represents tariffs, and the I just means for one specific country. Country I. So for example, we'll stick with New Zealand for now. So this means the formula is calculating the change in tariffs the US would have to charge country I, New Zealand. And that is to achieve trade balance. On the right-hand side, we work that out. X is the amount the US is exporting to that country. M is the amount it's importing from that country. So the difference is the trade imbalance, although wrong way around. Get to that in a moment. Underneath is where it gets fun. M is still the imports, but epsilon, the E thing, that represents the elasticity of demand for the imports going into the US, and the phi symbol, that represents the price pass-through of tariffs. That's a ratio of how much of the costs are passed on. Okay, so we'll break it down with an example. Let's say the US is importing a bottle of wine from New Zealand that would normally sell for, $100. And the reason it's $100 is tariffs are currently 0%, that's our baseline, and demand is 100%, but then tariffs go up by doubted tau, let's just say 20% for argument's sake. How much is that going to change the price? Well, that depends how much of this increase passes through to the customer. That was our symbol phi from before, some ratio. Let's say hypothetically it's 1/4, so prices go up by 5%. What's going to happen over here with demand. What's that going to be? Well, that depends how elastic demand is. That was our epsilon from before. And we could say hypothetically demand is 4 times whatever the percentage price change is. This does, of course, assume the elasticity of demand is linear. I looked up a much more complicated model from a research paper. There's your demand curve, and you've got 2 different supply curves because there's what the manufacturer are actually getting, and then there's what the consumer's seeing because of the extra tariff. Tau, we move to this point over here, and you can say it's linear, but what they've done is a bit of a oversimplification, and that's going to be a theme. But we should now just remind ourselves what we're trying to do. If you take all of your imports and subtract your exports, that's your trade deficit. And if you divide that by the imports, that's the percentage imports have to go down. This is the reduction in demand required. Oh, and that's what we've just worked out here. So there's our equation. And if you move the fine epsilon under here, rearrange it like that, this is exactly what the Trump administration were using. But of course, it's much more complicated than that. The diagram I showed you before is actually from a paper that looked at what happened after Trump's 2018 tariffs. Joint publication between the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and universities Princeton and Columbia. And this is the sort of detail you want to go into when you're bringing in tariffs. Look at this analysis. It's factoring in other things like how the price is going to change relative to demand. It's looking at possible reciprocal tariffs that come in. Like this is what you should be doing when you're planning tariffs to impact your economy. This level of detail. And we know they didn't put in that detail because on the Office of the United States Trade Representative page, they give all their working out and logic behind it. And there is our equation. And there is none of the detail we would like to see for something this complicated. They do admit that actually it would be very complex. I mean, if not impossible to do exactly, and that's true. But they just don't bother. They just decide to proxy it by this equation. Now, I've seen the discussion online that maybe this was generated by ChatGPT or something like that. I can't comment on that or even the economics behind it, but I can talk about the maths of the equation. For a start, the M and X are the wrong way around. You should be subtracting exports from imports. So it's just technically a negative coefficient they've put in there, but also at the same time, they've said epsilon is less than 0, which mathematically is very funny because epsilon normally means something else. But in this context, maybe that means demand goes down when prices go up. Would kind of cancel that. It's just all very odd. And there's one more thing that really bugs me.
Hey, Editor Matt, can you crop me down and move me right over so the bottom of the equation is right there? Okay, excellent. There's these asterisks. What are they doing there? So here's the thing about an asterisk in mathematical notation. It's not how you would write multiplication. I mean, we understand it to mean multiplication, but that's because sometimes if you're using a keyboard or a number pad or something that hasn't got a multiplication sign, you use the asterisk as like a replacement to mean multiply. So actually in Excel, you'll use an asterisk to represent multiplication, but it's only really used in terms of data entry. You use it when you're telling something to multiply. You never use it as a symbol to represent multiplication. For that we have the multiplication sign. Or some mathematicians obviously get quite lazy, so you'll see in more advanced maths, you won't use the multiplication sign anymore. You just put 2 characters next to each other. Or you'll use a dot. Very rare. It's very odd to use asterisks to represent multiplication when you're typesetting maths, which is what they're doing here. They're trying to show people what the formula is. They should just have them next to each other. I don't know why they've done it's like writing a note for someone and at the end of it drawing in the cursor. It's not what you do in the written version of this communication, even though that's what you might do if you're typing it in somewhere. You don't like a carriage return, cursor on the next line. That's not how it works. So I don't know, it's just weird. The whole thing reeks of mathsiness, which is where you can dress something up in the trappings of mathematics to make it look more legit, make it look more earned or worked out or, important, when what you may have done is just come up with an idea and then made it look more mathsy as a way to convince people you've put maybe more thought into it than you actually have.
And it gets
Thought into it than you actually have.
And it gets worse. I didn't just pick the values of phi as a quarter and epsilon as 4 at random. Those are the values the Trump administration used. And if you put them together, guess what happens to 4 and a quarter? Boom! They're gone! That phi and epsilon cancel out. It's like they're not even in the equation. Turns out this column is just the trade deficit as a percentage of imports. That's it. It's that simple, except it's not applied consistently. And I know that because I looked up the data.
Of course, I wanted to check everything for myself, so I went onto the government website to get the exact import and export figures for every single country that was in those first 2 charts I put in the spreadsheet. And thankfully, each page for those countries, there's a section at the bottom which follows a very similar format. So I pasted all of those into a text document. I could have done some kind of complicated scraping things, but for 50 entries, it was quicker to just do it manually. Because the sentences had all been generated algorithmically from their data, they were all very, very similar. So I could use find and replace to take out all the common bits and turn them into tabs, which meant that I could paste them into Excel, a little bit of tidying up, and there were 4 countries I couldn't find the data for, like Serbia and Tunisia and a couple others. I then had all the data, official government data, from the same department as the equation for 46 of those countries. It means I can now go through here. This has got all the countries in the order they appear on those printed out charts. It's got the 2 numbers that were printed on the chart. I then over here have the import amounts from 2024 in US dollars and the export amounts in US dollars. I can then work out the deficit fraction, which is the percentage we need to get it down by. And over here, I've then predicted what it should be based on their formula, and next to it is what's actually on the page. And if you have a look, a lot of these are very similar. But wait a minute, what's going on here? Negative 17 and 10. I'm going to reorder these and sort them by that deficit fraction from smallest to largest. And down the bottom here, these are the countries where the US is running a trade deficit. And as you can see down here, it matches perfectly. It's often off by 1%, but not always in the same direction. So there's some rounding going on somewhere. That's fine. But down here, these are the runs where the US is running a trade surplus, not a deficit. And so this is where the US are getting more money in than they're sending out. And all of these, they should have in theory a negative tariff according to their equation, because if the goal is just to have a balanced budget, then they should make the imports artificially cheap to move it back to being balanced. But it's not even just that. There's always this default. Okay, this is so weird. So for some reason, they half them all. So over here, they're all half, but it doesn't go below 10%. So what's interesting is 17 halves to 10, 20 halves to 10, and then 30 halves to 15. And from then on, you get the halving effect. And that half amount is apparently here the USA discounted reciprocal tariff. So, I mean, I'm not going to say they made up the epsilon equals 4, phi equals a quarter, but they're numbers that have come out of nowhere. And then suddenly they just chuck in a factor of 2 or a half, depending on how you look at it. And like, why? Like, why? Let's talk trade deficits very briefly. So the word deficit sounds bad and the word surplus sounds good. And I guess that would be true if you're looking at like money you are earning as a person or a business. But in terms of trade, they're just mathematical descriptions of the relative amounts of trade. There's no good or bad situation. A deficit can be good or bad. A surplus can be good or bad. It depends on all the details of what is being imported and exported and the wider economy. So for the New Zealand case, the US imports, well, primarily meat. Meat is the top import from New Zealand going into the US. After that, they've got other animal products, eggs, important to get some more eggs in the US, and beverages like wine. So that's what is going from New Zealand to the US. What's going from the US to New Zealand? Well, aircraft, spacecraft, machinery, nuclear reactors. It's a totally different type of trade, like completely different items. And now you stop and think, well, hang on, why is it important to import the same amount of wine as we export
aircraft. Like, why should those two things be the same? You got to look at everything separately. You might think, well, hang on, the wine imports make a difference to our local wine production, and maybe there are reasons to have tariffs to fine-tune your local wine production, or maybe in terms of exporting aircraft, if you want to encourage more US manufacturing, then that's good. You want to be selling more. I'm just saying, it's not as simple as surplus good, deficit bad. So in conclusion, these tariffs are being sold as reciprocal tariffs, but they're not reciprocal tariffs. They're the tariffs you would need to balance trade. And that in itself is being sold separately. If you don't listen to what Trump said, but you read what was put on the website, that's been sold as good. US are being ripped off with all these deficits. We need to get it back to be neutral or a surplus. And that's not true either. So there's some reason that they want to put tariffs on every country, and they've come up with a sufficiently mathsy way to justify it. And finally, speaking of tax on the American people, we'll use their exact wording from their website. They talk about what the unweighted averages are across all the countries, and an unweighted average in this case is meaningless because you can't average percentages because they're percentages of different amounts of things, has to be weighted. But they do tell us, weighted by imports, as it should be, the average across the entire globe is 41%. So that's the average tariff. And we know from their logic that whatever tariff you introduce, a quarter of that will be passed on to the consumer. Their numbers, their ratios, their everything, by saying the average increase in tariffs will be 41 percentage points, and a quarter of that, phi, the price pass-through, will go to the consumers. It means the Trump administration is saying that across all products imported into the US from every other country across the globe, the cost to consumers for everything they buy will go up by 10.25%. On average, that's everything. Some will be more, some will be less. Consumer spending is going to go up by over 10% on all imported products into the US. So there you are.
Do you believe Americans can afford higher prices because of tariffs?
They're not going to have higher prices. What's going to have and who's going to have higher prices is China and all of the countries that have been ripping us off for years.
Both those things are wrong. None of that's how that works. But it's just funny that on one hand they say tariffs won't put prices up and they're going to combat inflation. On the flip side, they are saying everything's going to go up by 10.25%, including, from New Zealand, eggs.
所以我之前就在说，我说这个川普他这个就是贸易啊，它不是那么简单的事情，是吧？你看他也说了，说你是顺差也好，你是逆差也好啊，你觉得听起来这个逆差好像很不好听，对吧？你是吃字了，是吧？你就觉得好像是不好的东西，然后你觉得这个顺差了啊，就是很好听，它就是一个好的东西，不是这么简单的。你不想想，你为什么从那个国家进肉？你为什么从那个国家进酒？你为什么你航空航天你制造的这个某些部件啊，还有这个原材料，你需要从这个国家进口？你为这些东西掏钱，你产生的赤字，会对你的经济产生负面的影响吗？这个东西不是简单的加加减减乘乘除除就能算出来的。我们看到他通过刚才他的分析，这个东西有多么的简单粗暴，就是出口额减进口额除以这个进口额，就一个百分比就可以了啊！我跟你说经济学啊，他拿那个供给曲线啊，做了一个解释。经济学所有的理论，它都要若干个前提条件，就是在什么什么的情况下，在什么什么情况下，在假设什么什么的情况下，在这种稳定的经济体的情况下啊，我们的供给需求才会沿着这个曲线去动，你才可以用最简单的数学公式去套它。一旦某个条件你没有考虑到，或者发生了额外的因素，它就不是按这个图表去走的，因为我们的真实的经济生活它是很复杂的。它不是你拿一个非常简单的一个加减乘除的图表就能表示出来的，所以它这个东西就是本身就很有意思啊，它这个能算出这个关税来，这个关税的比例让人就觉得啼笑皆非。然后又谈到刚才说的进出口的问题，这个逆差啊，顺差逆差就真的是逆差就是不好，顺差就是好吗？也不是这样的，而且川普说话前后矛盾，他承诺 他说什么呀？我们不会因为收关税就是而让商品的价格上涨的。但是你看他写的这个条文里，他就已经写了，这个所有的关税平均下来是41%。咱都不管他这个平均合不合理了。当时数学是体育老师教的嘛，就是真的是硬往上套就是我跟你说这个你不能这么来计算的然后25%要转嫁到这个商品上，就是至少平均所有的商品至少要涨10.25%。就是本身它也前后矛盾，对不对？就难怪大家这么反对它，就是说改革是好的，改革是要流血的改革是要有痛的，但是你这个什么叫什么不打麻药就直接上手术台，你这个硬开刀就把病人给治死了，对吧？就是我们也是需要这个柔和的政策你不能那个脸硬着地，对吧？好，今天就到这里，谢谢大家。